All right, welcome to a special webcast on the impact of BSIMM on software development programs. I'm David Rice, and in this webcast, I'm interviewing one of the authors of BSIMM, Gary McGraw. Gary McGraw is the CTO of Cigital, a software security and quality consulting firm with headquarters in Washington, D.C. He is a globally recognized authority on software security and the author of 6 best-selling books on the topic. The latest, Exploiting Online Games, was released in 2007. His other titles include Java Security, Building Secure Software, Exploiting Software, and Software Security. And he is the editor of the Addison Wesley Software Security series. Dr. McGraw has also written over 90 peer-reviewed scientific publications, authors a monthly security column for Inform IT, and is frequently quoted in the press. Besides serving as a strategic counselor for top business and IT executives, Gary is one of the advisory board members for Fortify Software and Raven White. His dual PhDs is in cognitive science and computer science from Indiana University, where he serves on the Dean's Advisory Council for the School of Informatics. Gary is an IEEE Computer Society Board of Governors member and produces the monthly Silver Bullet Security podcast for IEEE Security and Privacy Magazine, which I just had the privilege of doing with Gary this morning. So Gary is a wonderful friend and colleague in terms of when we start talking about software security, all of the challenges that confront us. And one of the most interesting things for me when I saw BSIMM come out in 2009 was as a consultant, I live in the world of frameworks, and frameworks are kind of stock and trade for many consultants. And when I saw BSIMM, I literally got excited because of all the possibilities that BSIMM brought about. So in this interview series, what I'm going to do is look first at the Application Security Summit that we'll be doing in February, and Gary McGraw will be giving the opening keynote there. And after a short overview of that summit, I'll get into the interview with Gary and talk about BSIMM in a little bit more depth. So the SANS Application Security Summit will be going on from January 29th until February 5th in San Francisco at the Sheraton Fisherman's Wharf. You'll see that there are a series of classes prior to the summit. So from January 29th through February 3rd, you'll see a host of different classes in terms of web application penetration testing. You'll see Defending Web Application Security Essentials, Secure Coding in Java, and of course one of my favorites, Secure Coding in .NET, but that's only because I happen to be teaching that class. So the summit days where Gary will be giving the opening keynote will be on February 4th and February 5th, and we've got a great lineup of folks. When we look at the next slide here, you'll see we have keynotes, again, by Gary McGraw from Cigital. We have Mike Howard giving the morning keynote on Friday morning. And then we have a host of experts and users. We have Brad Arkin from Adobe Systems. We've got Wilson Henriquez from Wells Fargo. We've got Jim Ruth, one of my favorites, from KPMG and formerly DTCC. We've got Bob Martin from MITRE, Chris Weiss-Sopel from Veracode, Roger Thornton from Fortify, and we've got Rafal Los from Hewlett-Packard. We have a number of other folks that are showing up. So we've got a great lineup. We've got lots of smart people with lots of great ideas, and most importantly, a lot of in-the-trenches stories so that we can come together and figure out a path forward going into 2010, 2011 for software security. So I encourage you to start planning today to come to the Application Security Summit. I really look forward. I'll be the chair of that summit. And the more the merrier, so I hope to see you there. So again, going back to BSIMM and going to Gary McGraw, BSIMM is just a wonderful framework, and when I saw it, I got really excited for a number of reasons. One is that it kind of gave a state of current practice, and I saw lots of different practices that people could apply in some type of conceptual framework, and that was really important because oftentimes we see point engagements, which are fine, but without really connecting the dots, without the conceptual framework to put it all together, people can be significantly challenged in getting the results that they want. So that was back in 2009. So in this interview, I want to sit down with Gary and see where he sees BSIMM evolving, where it's been, and some of the more interesting things that have happened. So Gary, thank you for joining us.
I'm pleased to be here. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Wonderful. So Gary, I've shared my excitement with BSIMM, as the introduction. But what are some of the things that you're most proud of regarding BSIMM since its release?
I think the thing that makes BSIMM stand out in the software security pile, where there's lots of excellent work, is that it's based on real data. So we had this notion, and the other people that had this notion with me are Brian Chess from Fortify and Sammy Miguez, who's a principal at Cigital. We had this notion of going out and studying existing software security initiatives that we thought were doing a good job. So we picked 10, targeted 10, and we ended up using 9 data sets. And we went out and we had interview sessions in person with the 9 executives running these large-scale initiatives. So, for example, we talked to Brad Arkin, who you mentioned before from Adobe, and Brad used to work for me back at Cigital in the mid-90s, believe it or not. And we talked to Steve Lipner at Microsoft, and we talked to David Hahn at Wells Fargo, and guys like that. And we spent a lot of time gathering data. Only after we had the data did we build a model. So this is really backwards for computer security. Usually in computer science or computer security, we have an idea, we have a structure, and then we go out and gather model data to kind of justify the existence of our model. We did it backwards for BSIMM. And so BSIMM you might think of as a descriptive model. You can see the little logo there is a bulldozer, which drives one of my guys, Drew Kilborn, totally crazy at Cigital. So I'm pleased to point it out. Hey, Drew, there's the bulldozer, and only you can guess what it's pushing around, the brown stuff. But that's the BSIMM in a nutshell. You want to advance the next slide? I'll tell you who participated.
Sure. Okay, next slide is up.
Yeah. So we had 9 companies in the original study. And I'm pleased to say that once we built the model, we went out into the world and we applied the model kind of as a measuring stick for software security. And we've since gathered data from 30 firms. So the original 9, you can see 7 of them here, includes Google and Microsoft and the Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation, where Jim Routh was before, EMC, Wells Fargo, Qualcomm, and then 2 other very large financial services firms who would prefer not to be named. And we took those data, and Brian and Sammy and I spent a good long time analyzing that data and creating the model from that data. We had no idea really what the structure of this model was going to be, other than a software security framework that I'll talk about in a minute. But like I said, since we started with the original 9, we expanded the study to include 21 other companies, and we also went to Europe, which you'll see on the next slide. And we studied 9 companies in Europe. You can see some of those companies here. There are 4 unnamed ones in this study. Because it only got released about a month ago. We're still seeking permission. Sometimes in Germany, permission takes a long time to pop out the other end of the corporate pipe. But you can see that there are companies like Nokia and Thomson Reuters and Swift and Telecom Italia, Standard Life. The interesting thing was to compare the data that we gathered in Europe to the data that we used to build the original model. And in fact, the coolest thing about the BSIMM of all, I think, is that if you get measured by the BSIMM, you can find out what you're doing and how that stands compared to what everybody else is doing, which has kind of been missing in the space for a while. These people have been doing excellent work for often over a decade. Nokia's project is about 10 years old, and Swift has been doing software security for 14 years. And
wow.
And they were doing a great job kind of in their own little world. And their question was, well, what's everybody else doing? And are we crazy? Or is everybody else doing generally the same thing? And that's what the BSIMM can help to answer.
That's great. So did you see a big difference between European practices and U.S. practices, or they were just very similar, they just didn't know it?
Well, the most striking thing was that they were more similar than we thought they were going to be. And there are 2 ways to go about describing this. BSIMM has 110 activities that it describes. And those are activities that we observed out there. So we went to Microsoft and we observed, for example, that they use a static analysis tool in a certain way in their build. And we wrote that down as one of the activities. Now, there are 110 of those, as I said before. And interestingly, in Europe, if you did the union of all activities observed in the European firms, it was less than 110 activities. So Europeans are doing slightly less, but they're doing mostly the same stuff than if you took the union of all activities observed in the original data set. That's 110, obviously. So that was kind of an interesting thing. The most striking thing was that that when you put the curves of the models together, and there's a slide with this later on in this presentation, what you see is that the overlap is most of everything, and then there are a few minor differences around the edges. So the differences were.
You mind if I fast forward to that slide, Gary?
It's probably better if you don't. Well, you did.
Oh, okay. All right. I did, but I can always wait.
What the heck? We can talk about it then when we get there. I can show you on the picture, but the differences were pretty obvious. Europe spends a lot more time worrying about process and thinking about getting things done the right way. So they're very process centric. And in fact, if you know anything about Swift, you know that the ISO 17799 standards pretty much came out of Swift. They wrote most of that stuff. Yeah. So not surprisingly, we observed that. They also have a way bigger emphasis on privacy. The U.S. is still not sure what that is or why we need it. So we saw a lot about privacy that we didn't see in the original data. And then in the United States, there's more emphasis on doing stuff that are assurance activities that actually look at things. So like code review and architecture risk analysis and penetration testing, a little bit more emphasis on that than we saw in the European data set. But by and large, they're pretty much the same.
Wow. So in terms of their process focus, did you see any significant differences in approach then in terms of the things that they were measuring?
Yeah. So that, can I take that as a metrics question, you think?
You absolutely may.
Well, so one of the things I was hoping we would be able to do is say, these are the metrics everybody's using, and look, we can all use these metrics, and they're the same. And sadly, I can't report that. What we found is that everybody does, in fact, use metrics. And in fact, a lot of organizations have sort of a portfolio level view of their entire software pile. It's not necessarily an application pile, because sometimes the software, like an Intel, the software is the stuff that makes chips. But it's a, they have a big view over their software pile, and they have various measures and metrics that they collect. And everybody has metrics. So you would wish that if you just did the union of all the metrics, then the best ones would pop out, or the most common ones. What we found is that metrics are kind of like internal organs. You really need to have a liver. That's a very important part of your body. But if you try to take your liver and put it in somebody else's body, that's kind of a problem. And metrics that we observed are so tied to the corporate culture that trying to divorce them or take them out of the corporate culture, and then even worse, implant them into another corporate culture, often results in failure. And so that's the one thing I can say about metrics is, boy do we need them, and boy does everybody want them, and boy are they all different.
Now I'm curious on the metrics front, because part of the holy grail that I've been pursuing is looking at how security, if in any way, impacts financial, the balance sheets, whether the P&L statements, whatever it happens to be. And of course, I call it a holy grail because I'll probably go crazy in that quest. But in the metrics that you did see out there, did you see any binding of the metrics, say, on the technology side, in any way influencing those on the financial side?
Absolutely. So why don't we go to the next slide so we can at least look at something else while we're talking about this. But yeah, we see all sorts of ties to the business. And in fact, there's sort of 4 major categories of things in the BSIMM. Those 110 activities fit into these 4 super categories. And one of the categories is about governance. And as you might imagine, governance has everything to do with the business. Now, some software security initiatives that we've visited and observed have a much closer tie to business impact, and budgets are driven by vulnerabilities, and other sorts of interesting business ties are easy to observe. Other places are much more technical and geeky, but most places have a massive tie to the business. And as you might imagine, in the financial services vertical, where we have 12 firms represented, the tie to the business is absolutely key to the software security initiative. You mentioned Jim Routh, who was the the CSO at DTCC, and he's going to be participating in San Francisco, which is totally great because Jim's a good friend. Jim is particularly good at tying the business to the technical stuff. And I think it's kind of, you got to have both. If you're missing one or the other, then you only have one hand, and it's always better to have two.
Agreed. Yeah, I remember hearing, one analogy to say that, if a company goes into business without any type of financial statements, it's like driving without any headlights at night. If it steers the company only through its financial records, it's like driving the company by only looking in the rearview mirror. And the funny thing is it sounds like software security is still in the mode of driving at night without any headlights.
Yeah, it feels like that sometimes. When I was an adolescent male, I used to do that on purpose. There was this long, skinny bridge over this lake, and we would turn off our headlights and see how far we would go before we would chicken out and turn them back on. But don't tell anybody. It was Tennessee.
So year on, what kind of surprised you the most? I understand, the difference between Europe and the U.S. was great. From a high level, what kind of surprised you the most? Once BSIMM was released and ingested by the community?
I think we wrote an article about 10 surprising things that we observed, which is available on the Inform IT site, or you can get it through BSIMM, and we'll give you the URL later in this presentation. So there's that. But the thing I think that was the most striking is that you can think about software security as a fairly long cultural evolutionary business process. It's like business re-engineering. Right, so this is not something that you just run out, buy a static review tool, and throw it to all the developers and everything's fine. That's not how it works. So at a place like Microsoft, where you have
many seem to do that,
at a place like Microsoft, you have 30,000 developers. The question is, how do we change the culture at Microsoft so that the 30,000 guys who write code all day long think about software security and carry out the right sorts of assurance activities, and they do it in a reasonable, business-driven fashion that is consistent and we can measure. And that's what the SDL kind of describes. So there are ways of doing this in organizations, and the evolution of that initiative in all 30 firms that we've observed so far is a different story. There is no one way. First you do this, then you do that, then you do this, then you go to that, and then you're done. But even though the stories are all completely different, I mean so different that if anybody ever said, you should do this now and it should take you 2.5 weeks, they should just be pilloried as a very silly person, because I'm sorry, but that's just not, the data don't support that. But on the other hand, even though the stories are all completely diverse, what you have is a way of measuring the results that they all kind of look the same, right? So you hold up the BSIMM measuring stick and you go, wow, even though their story of how they got to the top of this hill is different than those guys' story, they're all sort of standing in the same space from a software security activity perspective. And I think that's really kind of cool. So,
that is.
You can think of it as like a thermometer, right? So the way we got to 32 degrees was different in all 30 cases, but everybody's sort of in the same range on the thermometer. It's kind of cool.
Yeah, that is neat. So one analogy that I remember you giving at one of your keynotes was in building BSIMM, it was kind of like an archaeological dig.
Oh, yeah.
You laid out the grid, and then you kind of found, okay, what do I find in this grid? What do I find in this grid? And then you went back and built a conceptual framework around that.
Yep.
So in terms of that grid, do you see the grid expanding? Do you think you've got maybe 80%? Where do you see the grid?
I don't see the grid expanding. So I think the grid's on the next slide. Maybe why don't you forward over to the software security framework. This is the grid you're referring to, and the 12 squares that say strategy, metrics, compliance, and policy, attack models, architecture analysis, pen testing, and so on. Those 12 squares are the 12 grids in the archaeology grid, the 12 squares. Yep. So, in archaeology, the first thing you do is you stick a stake in the sand and you run a piece of string and you square things off. And then when you find a Roman artifact or an arrowhead, you write down which square you found it in. And so we were really trying to capture these activities that everybody was doing, and the activities could be as wide as possible, but whenever we discovered one, we wanted to fit it into one of these buckets. So for example, if somebody said, oh yeah, well, we have a code review tool and we put it in the build and it's centralized, we go, oh, well, that obviously goes in the code review bucket, so we would stick it in the code review bucket. Or they say, oh, we have a whole training curriculum, and we have, not only do we have defensive programming for C and C++ and Java, but we're also doing PHP and, blah, blah, blah. And so we would put that obviously into the training bucket. So this framework is the way that we organize those activities. Now, wouldn't it be nice and beautiful, and you would know this wasn't data-driven if this were the case. Wouldn't it be nice and beautiful if there were 10 activities for each one of these squares? Wouldn't that be great? Well, it doesn't work that way.
Very even.
There are 110 activities, and they're spread willy-nilly over these 12 boxes. And some boxes have 14 things, and some of them have 5. And why is that? Because that's what we observed. Because, we just walked out into the jungle and we said, what do we see? Oh, look, monkeys eat bananas. And we wrote that down. Which box does that belong in? And that was the driving force behind the BSIMM. Just to emphasize this a little too much, this is a descriptive model. It's not a prescriptive model. It doesn't purport to tell you what you should do. In fact, it's not clear that anybody could tell you what you should do. Maybe they would base it on their own personal experience, but hopefully they would have a deep understanding of your company culture before they try to impose some sort of prescriptive model on you. And so the BSIMM doesn't do that. That's one of its kind of weaknesses. On the other hand, it's also a strength because I can take data from lots of diverse companies, put them into the same model, and say, look, there are things that everybody else is doing and you're not doing them. Now, maybe you have perfectly legitimate reasons for not doing that. Maybe you don't even want to do that, but you should at least have a story about why you're not doing that, since everybody else seems to think it's a good idea. And that's kind of the nature of the model. So
I think go ahead. Yeah.
I wanted to go kind of back to an idea presented on the last slide. You don't have to put it up, but we started with data and we built this model, and then we gathered 3 times more data, and the model was validated. We didn't have to expand it. There's never been an activity we have observed that wasn't in the model, and we thought, oh darn, we got to add something to the model. And I'll tell you this, if we do observe other activities, we will add them to the model, because that's the nature of this beast. So we just got lucky that our initial data set was really emblematic of kind of the whole space and helped to define the space nicely, or capture the space nicely. Not define, but capture. On the other hand, we only had 9 vectors of 110 activities in the beginning. And so now that we have 30, we can do some math, which is extremely cool. So I noticed that Betsy Nichols was actually lurking on this call. Hi, Betsy, I see you there. And Betsy and Sammy Miguez are now very busy crunching the data that we have, the 30 vectors for the 30 firms of 110. And we have a statistically significant data set, which is absolutely cool. So we're going to be able to say things about our model. We can sort of validate whether or not our division into 3 levels was any good. We can talk about correlations between activities. We can talk about whether there are certain activity clusters that are correlated with those with high maturity and so on. And I'm just completely stoked to see what Betsy and Sammy are coming up with. Yesterday, I put the last 2 vectors into the data pile from 2 large corporations. And so now that we've got 30, let the number crunching begin, and we're going to be able to say with some authority, here's the data set that we observed, and these are some trends, and not only is it a trend, but here's the Pearson coefficient, and so this seems to be statistically significant.
Oh, that's powerful. That is powerful. So I like the notion that it's not prescriptive, it's descriptive. And so when someone is going to be using the framework to their advantage, what did you see as some of the most successful first steps people leveraging BSIMM have taken?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, the first steps can only be described in a meta fashion because you know, the actions that you take after you get your BSIMM score are going to have everything to do with the gap between where you want to be and where you are. And that's tied to an individual company. So you couldn't say overall 30, well, everybody started doing foo, because that would mean foo didn't belong in the model. But I can give you an example while protecting the company that this came from. Yesterday, I was at a large financial services firm, and I was delivering their BSIMM results to the CSO and other very senior executives, and the e-commerce group especially. And we showed them the shape of their software security initiative as opposed to, you know, the shape of other financial services corporations. And we said, you know, there's a couple things that are just kind of hit you in the face obvious that are just not here. And you guys probably should spend some time trying to make this thing more balanced and less spiky. It looks like a butterfly now. And we haven't really seen too many butterflies around or prickly things. You know, everybody else looks kind of round, so maybe you should think about why you don't look round. And then they would take action based on that. So that's kind of the idea.
And what was the impetus? Where did the impetus come from in that particular instance, or to abstract it out? Where do you see the impetus coming from? Is it the software group, or is it a CSO?
Oh, that's a
Who
great
seems
question.
to be the driver of it?
Every company that we've studied, every single one of the 30 has a software security group. And in fact, if you want to do a software security initiative, you might say the data suggests that you should form a software security group first. And if you don't have one of those, then you have sort of a business 101 problem, which is the developers are pointing over at the security dudes. The security dudes are pointing over at the developer guys, and nobody's standing in the middle. So guess who gets the job done? Nobody. Who gets fired? Nobody. Who gets rewarded? Nobody. You know, and so nobody does the job. And the software security group can certainly help to address that. Now, software security groups do fall in many different places in organizations, and so sometimes they're in the office of the CTO. Sometimes they're reporting directly to the CIO, sometimes the CSO, sometimes the chief risk officer, like at one big bank in New York. It's the CRO who reports to the board. But almost in every case, except for maybe 2 or 3 in the data set, we're talking the executive running the software security group has a lot of juice. They can both create budget and provide political coverage for the activities that the software security group is supposed to carry out. So we're not talking about some geeks who decide to get a few $1,000,000 and buy a tool and spread the tool everywhere. That would be something we've just never observed. Now we've cleaned up messes from that approach at Cigital for many years, but none of those companies are in the BSIMM model. You know, so these are people that have a pretty balanced approach. Now this SSG thing is a little bit controversial, I suppose, enough that I made it the topic of my Inform IT article for December. So and the title of that article is Why You Really Need an SSG. So if you're in a company and you want to get software security done and you want to build a secure SDLC and hook into the business stuff and, you know, do the right metrics and all that stuff, and you want to gather resources and then expend them in a clever way, then, you know, building an SSG is job one.
Yeah, no, I agree. In fact, I've used the BSIMM on a number of engagements, and I've been able to leverage BSIMM even for development groups of 10 folks. And the SSG is just, you know, a guy who's part-time who decided, hey, listen, I want to kind of take up the banner. But even in the smallest instances, and the reason why I bring this up for the audience is, you know, there seems to be the notion that, you know, software security has to be big at some point. And maybe that's very true if you really want to get a lot of progress. But in those first steps, I agree with that SSG, because even those small little formations of just one employee kind of taking up the banner, we've seen tremendous progress.
Let me tell you another thing that we found. So we collected numbers while we were at it. We said, hey, how many people in your SSG? Oh, yeah? Well, how many developers do you have? And then we said, hey, why don't we do some division? if you divide the number of developers, if you divide the SSG size by the number of developers, or vice versa, you end up with a ratio, and the percentage is in the whole data set 1%. The percentage in 30 firms is actually 1.15%. I can't tell you the correlation value, but I will soon be able to do that, right, Betsy? So I can say with confidence what we observed is an SSG size like this appears to be what people seem that's what's working. And so, you know, before as a consultant, when a big corporation would come and they would say, well, how many guys do I have to have doing this job? We just make stuff up based on our experience. Now,
it's a swag.
Yeah, that's right. Well, it's based on experience, and we're smart guys, and we get paid well because we're good. But nevertheless, you know, I didn't have any real numbers to back that up. Now we have real numbers to back that up, and that's what happens when you build a descriptive model. Now, a further question would be, well, are SSGs all organized the same? That's a really good question. They're not. And in fact, one of the things that might be nice for the BSIMM community to take on, and I know that there's a kind of an impetus underfoot at Symantec to build a community around BSIMM and also around people that are doing software product, secure product development stuff. And the guys in the trenches that get together and talk about, well, how are we organized versus how you're organized? What's working? What's not working? And this notion of comparing yourself to others and showing each other your belly buttons is really critical to the field, because some very good people have been doing this for 10 years. And we've all learned
that imagery brings so much to mind.
Sorry, Steve Lipner's belly button's not really well, whatever. So the notion of people that were doing this kind of in a vacuum, or they were doing it in their own organization and being highly successful, now able to go out and talk to their peers who are doing the same thing in a different corporation is important. There's one other issue I want to address. You can go ahead and advance the slide if you want, but the issue is some people have criticized me for only focusing the BSIMM on large organizations, and I just plead guilty to that. I'm guilty. It turns out that my job as software security advocate and a guy who really cares passionately about this space is to get to as many people as I possibly can, and I figured the best way to do that is to go to huge corporations that have 30,000 developers and work on them. Because if I can take care of 30,000 at once, that's a lot more than 10. And so, one of the things you can do to add up kind of the impact of BSIMM is to look at just the total number of developers that we're talking about, the total number of SSG members, and those numbers are large. And that is very heartening because, gosh, when John Viega and I wrote Building Secure Software in 1999, published it in 2000, we couldn't even convince our mothers that this was a good idea, right? And we've come a good long way since then, and that's great. And there are a lot of people that are doing this.
Are they on your side now? At least because all the books are sold?
My mother died in the meantime, but yeah, she did sort of come to understand it. That's okay, this is part of life. So
okay, we've got a question from the audience real quick. So this is from Nathan Christensen. He says, do any of the SSG have multiple specialists of different development? We have a group that does internal development and one group that does web development in multiple different languages. The answer, going back to the core question, do any of the SSGs have multiple specialists? The
answer, Nathan, is absolutely they do. And in fact, sometimes you'll see people that are in an audit capacity. You'll find code review people, maybe of different flavors. So you got a C++ guy and a Java guy, or a Java group and a C++ group. You'll see architects who talk with enterprise architecture and work with the software requirements group all the time. And then you'll see executives, and sometimes you even see, in many cases, somebody that is specifically assigned training. And they may even be an HR person that's dotted lined into the SSG, who makes sure that everybody in the organization is getting trained. So you do see lots of different kinds of people in those SSGs. I'm hoping to get more into that and to publish some more data about that eventually. But the one article is where to start. You really need an SSG, has a little bit of that in it. So check that out, Nathan. Right, so let's talk about this slide a little bit.
Yep.
We already talked about Europe versus the US, so you can see those two curves on the bottom of this chart. The original 9 is the blue curve called the 9. That's Google and Microsoft and EMC and those guys. And then the EU group is red. And so you see those differences in the 9 paying a little bit more attention to attacks and to testing, and the Europeans paying more attention to compliance and policy. Say that's where privacy popped out, software environment, and even pen testing. So this is a very low resolution view of results. If you remember the 12 things from our archaeology grid, the software security framework from before, you can see there's a vector here. There are 12 vectors, one for each one of those squares. And so we can put a dot on that vector according to the number of activities that we observed in that square. And in this case, we're using what's called a high watermark view. So if you did anything in level 3, you get a 3. A very low resolution view, but really cool to compare either yourself to a group of companies or to compare groups of companies. So another obvious comparison is seen at the top. This is a vertical comparison of 12 financial services companies as on top of 7 ISVs, and the ISVs include obviously Microsoft and Google and the others that we mentioned before, and the financial services companies include Wells Fargo and some people that we haven't talked about yet. So this is interesting. This data is brand new. I just made this data yesterday. It hasn't been published before.
Oh, wow.
But you can see that the ISVs are in charge in almost everything except for 2 places, and the 2 places are telling: compliance and policy, which is not surprising given that financial services are a regulated industry, and security features and design, that's SFD. And security features and design may come as a surprise until you realize that at Microsoft, you don't want to go to a development group and say, hey, you guys, you have to code this. You have to use this code when you make your thing. Because those are guys who write code. On a bank, on the other hand, you say, hey, here's how we use OpenSSL. Here's how we use struts. Do it this way. Steal this code. And you see a lot more of that in the financial services than you see in the ISVs. And so, and then on the other side of the coin, lots of testing in the ISVs. It's all about probing and testing, both white box security testing done by QA and the developers themselves, if you're in a Scrum situation or if you're doing test first development or Agile stuff, and penetration testing, PT. And so, you know, the cool thing once again is this is actual data. So what I'm not saying is I think blah. What I'm saying is here's the data. Now we can have an interpretation of the data, which is really just, to me, just absolutely exciting. I've had such a great time with this project. I can't begin to tell you.
No, I agree. So when you're presenting the spider graph in front of the executives, what are some of the questions that just kind of pop out of them? What are their driving motivations at that point?
Well, I described yesterday a situation in which we had, imagine the blue curve on the bottom graph, or the top graph looks similar. The
financials,
the blue curve versus a particular company, because I can also graph an individual company on here. Then you can say, gosh, why are we behind the average in, say, strategy and metrics? What does that mean? How come we're behind the average on code review? What's everybody else doing that we're not doing? Nobody wants to be behind the average, which is ironic since the average is the average everywhere except for Lake Wobegon. But the first questions pop out of everybody's mind when they look at this low resolution view of the data is that, you know, why am I behind? Or why am I ahead? Or gosh, why is my shape so oblong? You know, or why do I have one tent pole here? What's the deal? And so this view lets you really understand the width and breadth and a little bit of the depth of software security activities. Now, I will say that there are other way better views into the data. I don't have them in this presentation because, you know, we didn't have too long to have this chat, and we wanted to chat about other stuff anyway. But when you come to see the thing in San Francisco, the SANS Summit, we're certainly going to show that data. So I'll show you a scorecard which has all 110 activities on it in a way that we can score an individual company against a group. And I'll also show you a kind of an equalizer diagram that shows you which activities you are and are not doing in the along the whole model. And those are other different resolutions of the data that you can get from undergoing this process.
That's powerful. That's powerful. So what then, as we come near our closing time, what do you see as the greatest impact since BSIMM has been released on software development programs or just in the business in general?
Yeah, why don't you go to the next slide?
Sure.
I mean, ironically, the title of the slide that we're getting ready to go by, actually skip that one. Just keep on going.
Okay.
This sort of explains the state of BSIMM. That's why I wanted to go to this slide and tell you about kind of the parts. The thing that we found is that when I first gathered the data and I had companies as diverse as Google and Microsoft who didn't disappear in a puff of logic and Wells Fargo in the same study, I thought maybe we would end up with two models, one for ISVs and one for financial services organizations. And remember, I didn't really care how we described the data. I just wanted this thing to be data-driven. Well, my intuition was wrong. It turns out that one model very nicely described all the data. And that's very important because it turns out that software security as carried out at an ISV is so similar to software security as carried out by a financial services company that they can be described using the very same measurement tool. That's cool. Mm-hmm. Now the financial services guys were particularly wagging their tail about this because they'd been getting the ISVs telling them stuff like, oh, well, you know, our software is different and we're different than you are, and you really don't want to see the static analysis results of ours because they're so different. These are not the droids you're looking for, right? So some sort of Jedi mind maneuver. And based on the BSIMM, we can say, hey, nobody's a special snowflake. We all do the same stuff. We all brush our teeth and we get out of bed and we take a shower in the morning. Look at that. and you should ask them how they take their shower because that'll tell you about how their software is, right? So those sorts of insights are offered to us because of the BSIMM measurement capabilities. So onto the state of where we are. Everything that we created and roll-ups of the data is available for free under the Creative Commons license at bsi-mm.com. So if you want to get the model and look at the data, including the European data and the 9 data, both of those are reported in the current version 1.5 of the BSIMM, you can get that stuff. Now, if you don't like our model, then you want to do another model, for God's sakes, use the data. That's all I ask. No more faith-based software security because I said so, right? So, you know, that was a necessary step. I did my share of that, but we're getting past that. We're moving on into science now. And so if you're going to have a theory, then it should be based on data, and it should also be something that we can either, back up with data or discredit with data. As you can see, there are Italian and German translations. This is particularly important for me because I'm going to Germany to give a keynote on this on Tuesday at the OOP conference in Munich. And so we got a German translation done. And, you know, the thing started with 9 companies. Now it has 30. We've got a statistically significant data pile. We're doing some really cool analysis. We're going to report those results at RSA. Betsy Nichols and Sammy Miguez have a talk on this stuff, and we'll be rolling out BSIMM 2 very soon. So we're going to try to release as much data as we possibly can. The only reason we can't release everything is because we don't want to expose the individual contributors. That is, we don't want to say Microsoft looks exactly like this and here's what they are and aren't doing, because we told them we wouldn't do that. And the way we got everybody to participate was by talking about how we were going to use this for the common good. And if this thing in my wildest dreams is ultra successful, it will in fact engender an arms race for the common good, where people are trying to outdo their neighbors. You know, you measure yourself and you say, I want to be taller than those guys over there. And everybody races to the top of software security, which would be super, super cool. I think we've built a yardstick, and I think it's exceptionally powerful and really useful.
No, it is. When I look at this, you know, one of the things I harp on is the asymmetry of information. That is, you know, for executives to be able to look left and look right and to know what their competitors / partners are doing, it wasn't available. And this certainly gives that visibility and resolves some of that. I think some of the biggest things, the potential impact, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Gary, is that if financial institutions or institution X can say, I'm not that different from the ISVs, they can actually be more specific and demand more from the software manufacturers that they're delivering the software. Would that be a correct statement?
That's absolutely right. That's totally correct. And not only that, I said before, that makes the Wall Street guys wag their tails vigorously. And they're busy doing that, which is cool. But you know, furthermore, I think that we accidentally created a community. And we didn't really mean to do that, right? We were really just scientists gathering data and building a model to describe what we saw. But last year at RSA, we were all going to be at RSA, you know, everybody that was in the BSIMM study. I think it was Brad Arkin sent me some mail, and he was like, dude, is everybody from the BSIMM study coming? And I was like, yeah, probably. He's like, well, let's get together. And I was like, duh. Of course, let's get together. You guys should know each other. So now, you know, that was when Brad first met Steve. And now Brad, who's in the hot seat, as you know, at Adobe, trying to get those guys up to speed and making great progress, I might add, can call up Steve and say, hey, Steve, you know, when you guys were in the front page of the Wall Street Journal every week and things were looking gloomy and dark and your boss was aiming a big gun at your head, what did you do? How do you control PR? How do you message properly? How do you get in front of this thing? And, you know, Steve has a bunch of great stories about that because that's precisely what he did at Microsoft.
Yep, no, absolutely. I had a conversation with Brad a couple of weeks ago, and he's definitely, I mean, in the hot seat, but certainly the guy to be there.
Oh, he's super. He's
definitely he's super skilled to drive it. So.
Well, just so you know, Brad's experience, he helped me to found the SSG at Cigital in 1997 with John Viega, who's now the chief security officer at McAfee. So those were my two right-hand guys. It was John and Brad, and there you have it. 13 years later, here we are.
It grows. So how can people find out more about BSIMM?
Well, like I said before, there's a website that's a BSIMM website. It's not a Cigital thing. It's a community thing. And all the stuff is posted there, including links to the articles that I mentioned and press coverage and other stuff like that. Other people who have helped with the project, including SANS and CSO Magazine, and I'm leaving Virtual Forge in Germany, and Minded Security in Italy, who did the Italian translation, and Betsy Nichols, who's helping with the analysis. All those guys are going to be on the website soon. So you can get the model itself. You can just download it. There's an electronic clickable version too. The really cool thing is it's kind of a long document, but the reason it's long is because for each of the 110 paragraphs in the model, there's a description that says, here's why you do it, here's what you do, and here's an example or two. And in every single case, every single example in the entire document is real. That is, that's what we saw. So we're not making any of this up. We're not saying, gosh, you could maybe do it this way, or wouldn't it be cool if people did this? Instead, we're saying, hey, you know, office hours, good idea because it leverages teachable moments, and maybe you could have office hours in the senior SSG's office every Wednesday at 4, which was a real example from Google. And there you have it. So pretty exciting stuff, and I really just encourage people to use it, and at the very least, if you don't like it, take the data and do something cool with the data, because the data are just outstanding, and we're excited to be doing some science in software security.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for the wonderful conversation, Gary. To the audience, thank you for joining us. Gary McGraw, again, will be giving the opening keynote at the SANS Application Security Summit at the Sheridan Fisherman's Wharf in San Francisco on February 4th. So please join us, and I'm excited to see that the new data and new material that's coming out from BSIMM. Thanks again, Gary.
Thank you, David. See you soon.
Wonderful. Okay, so you can visit us at www.sans.org/appsec-2010. That will give you, again, the overview for all of the events. That will give you the courses that will be offered. So if you have people out there that are looking for training, certainly consider the training options we have prior to the summit on the 4th and 5th, or the What Works in Application Security Summit on February 4th and 5th. So again, please plan on attending and go forth and do good in the software assurance and cybersecurity realm. Thank you for all for joining us. Have a great day. Cheers.